All right. So, hi, Ebony. It's so nice to meet you. Thank you so much for reaching out to me.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I can't wait to chat with you about ADHD and me.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start out with asking you the question I'll start out with asking you the question I ask all of my guests, which was, when were you diagnosed with ADHD and what was going on in your life that you started to kind of put these questions, or, put two and two together and say, I really should look into this diagnosis.
Mhm. So, just to start and backtrack, in high school and even in grade school, I was always known as, uh, I guess, on my report card, can't focus or not paying attention. But I always found a way to cope with that and work with that because I just thought it was normal. And I always had good grades. So I guess the teachers noticed me just doodling or looking around. I was not the one to get up out of my seat a lot. But so then in high school, I would always be the last one to finish my tests. I would actually sometimes not finish. And, I got tested. I was fine because I guess I scored so high. They just thought I was fine. And it never seemed like a problem to other people because my grades were just great. And so it was just like, oh, well, she's probably fine because usually people with ADHD, their grades are probably not as great because they can't focus. But I found a way, I guess I just thought it was normal. So I just worked with it and I was like, oh, this is normal. Let me see how I can fix this. I would always do note cards, just anything. I always had to have visuals on my note cards to see and connect my brain with the pictures. I just found ways that worked for me without even questioning, is there something wrong with me? And then when I got to college, I was like, oh, why is this so hard? Why aren't my coping skills working? Like, why is my technique not working for me? And I was in a lecture hall, and I don't know for the life of me why I tried to major in biology because I'm a creative person. And I was in like a science, I think it was biology or something, and I was just staring, like, my brain just kept wandering. Um, no matter what I did to try that tools I used in high school to focus in class, no. Meanwhile, I'm telling you, like back in high school, I was in a smaller school, so I was fortunate enough not to get lost or left behind. But in college, it's so much bigger, so professors aren't going to hold your hand if you're not focusing or don't finish an exam. That's it. So I just, knew something was wrong. And, I was like, oh, I thought high school was hard. No, this is hard. Like this college, adulthood, whatever. I was like, I think I have a problem. And so I, went to get diagnosed. And I was diagnosed at like 19, 18, 19 years old. And they told me that I most likely have ADHD. And that's, when I learned about kind of what it was. I did my own research because the person who diagnosed me did not like fill me in on everything, every detail. I actually recently found out the extent of what ADHD is when I now am getting remedicated after not being on medication for like a gap of like 6 years. So yeah, and I figured out that was, that's what I have. It was comforting to know that there is something, a name for it. It wasn't just my brain, because in college I was like, oh, there's something wrong with me. I was like, this is not right. And just hearing that, oh, it's ADHD and there are ways to help you focus, I knew that was it for me. And I was able to get down and do my work and, you know, be
Yeah.
myself.
Yeah, I had a really positive experience with my diagnosis. It felt very, in hindsight, and all the women I've talked to, it feels like, it was really simple. I kind of went to my doctor who I showed her all these self-tests and everything, and we had a half-hour conversation, and she diagnosed me there in the office. And then she gave me a prescription for medication, and that was it. There was like no
Yeah.
conversation
Yeah.
about what it is, or I mean, I think she probably assumed that I was going to do my own research, and and sort of sent me on my way, or could tell that I had already done some research. But it's still, now in hindsight, I'm fascinated that there was no conversation outside of try this medication. And
Yes.
yeah, so
It
was
was
that you were medicated when you were first diagnosed in college? And then what made you decide to go off it for 6 years?
so going back to what you said about not being educated about it, which is, I think, is a big portion of it's a big part of dealing with ADHD, to understand it, what your how your mind works. Not, I mean, yourself, but to know the extent of ADHD, what so you can identify little things if you're not sure. Is this ADHD? Is this what I'm doing ADHD? So when I was diagnosed, uh, I just figured that let me go to a behavioral therapist and, get treated. And, I got the prescription. He just handed it to me. And, we would discuss how I'm feeling. He put me on Concerta. And I just to say, there are so many ADHD medications now that I know about, that I know so much more about it than I did in the past, because I wasn't educated. So I just thought there was Concerta at the time. And I took Concerta and I lost my appetite. And I felt like I was just, I had ADHD when I was taking it. It like gave me super ADHD. And when I was diagnosed, I went to see a behavioral therapist, and he prescribed me Concerta. And, in the past, I didn't know that there were so many drugs, so many medications for ADHD, that you just find one that works for you. And so he just offered me Concerta, and it didn't seem like there was an option to take anything else. So I just thought that was it. So I took it and I lost my appetite, and it kind of gave me, it kind of seemed like it made me look like I have ADHD on the outside, because I was just hyperactive. Like it did something weird where it's just like, oh, it externalized my ADHD. And I was just, I don't know if it actually
Oh.
helped. And I just didn't feel right on it. I would have heart palpitations, and the doctor I had wasn't great. And I actually called him and asked him, if I should be experiencing these heart palpitations, is this a normal side effect? And he was like, oh, I'm sorry, you have to make an appointment. He couldn't even tell me that. Like, you should go to the emergency room. That's not normal. So it was really, and then I just stopped cold turkey. That was hard. It was like withdrawal symptoms. And I just said, let me not take this, because it's not helping me and there's no point in me taking this. And I'll just go back to how I was in high school and try to cope with it on my own. And reaching adulthood and moving out to Los Angeles, I was like, oh, where I'm in a job now where it requires me to focus. And in a career of writing, I mean, for someone who cannot for the life of me sit down in one spot to even do a simple task, well, writing's not that simple, but to just do a task like that of writing, it was so hard. And so that's kind of why I stopped taking Concerta, and now I'm taking Adderall as an adult.
And you're finding it's much better. You're having a
Yeah,
much better reaction to it.
yeah, I had
Yeah.
tried.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the other thing. There's so many different types out there. And so even just finding which one your body reacts to the best can feel like a full-time job a lot of the time,
mm-hmm,
right? Just it
mm-hmm,
could be so exhausting. I've tried two at this point, and I'm at that stage where I'm like, I really need something. I really need some help. What are my options? What is my treatment plan? What's happening? And where, what else do I want to try? And it's a lot.
yeah,
And
you have
even
to
just
like do
making the
your
doctor's
homework.
appointments and the follow-ups and
It's
yeah, I
it
know.
is.
Meanwhile, yeah, like
It's like,
mm.
speaking of
Oh,
it
and
being a
then
lot. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, and then the question, when you said, I'm just going to go back to coping with it on my own, I just like had that visceral reaction, right? Because I feel like there's so many times where we do that, where we're just like, oh, you know what? Forget it. I'll just figure this out on my own. And then you think about your life in high school doing all of that, right? And then as adults, the evidence of struggle is not there, right? And it's like, if you have ADHD, you must have shown evidence of struggle throughout your life. And so many adult women sort of feel like we've been managing for so long on our own that, how do I even prove the struggle?
Exactly. That's exactly how I feel. And, just seeing that
Yeah.
in high school, it was, it wasn't a problem until, after that, you just see that whatever you were doing doesn't work. But then I tried to make myself believe, oh no, it was working. I'm crazy. Like that, it will work because it worked before, but it is totally not the same. Uh, you dealing with different things. You have different things coming at you. Adulthood requires attention to multiple things because you have more responsibility, and it's just overwhelming. And those, I mean, maybe some parts of what I did in high school will work, maybe studying wise, but no. So I'm, grateful that I was able to find the help to flourish.
Yeah, right. I know. I feel like I talk about that a lot with guests, that the ways in which we sort of experience these peaks and valleys in our executive functioning around ADHD. And then, and usually it's at it in when we're in a valley that we start to look into this diagnosis, or, feel like, wait, there's more happening here than just depression, or all those ways when you're just like, oh my God, I can't cope. And why so many of us during the pandemic, myself included, that's how I got diagnosed, just felt like everything fell apart. And we, wanted to go, started to look into it. Now, when you started looking back into it, or at least looking back into medication, this was after you moved to California. So what's the timeline there? How long have you been in California?
I moved to California in 2019, right before the pandemic, October 2019. So I've been there for about 2 years. Um, and I, hadn't been on medication, um, not even anxiety medication, because I also have anxiety. And a lot of people with ADHD, everyone knows, people who have ADHD know that they also most likely have anxiety that pairs with it. Just one of the many beautiful things. uh, and so, I it was hard to move to LA to begin with, and having anxiety and ADHD, that was a struggle. And so I started seeing a therapist again, um, along with you know getting medicated for my anxiety. So I took one step at a time, went back on anxiety medication, and then when I got my job and I realized this is a job where I can't be messing up, I have to focus and be on top of things. And I'm going to need to go back on something because I need to do well at my job, because me just working with my ADHD is not enough. I need to have that extra support. So I went to look up online some ADHD treatment center, and I got medicated. They educated me on ADHD. They told me all about the medications, that I had options, that we were going to get through this together. I just felt relieved to know that, I, like, it's not Concerta. It's there's more than that. Like, it's just not one size fits all. So I went on Adderall. I think I tried a few. It is exhausting because you're that first few weeks or so, you're trying to figure out which medication works for me. And so I would go, and I think I tried a few different medications, and I found that Adderall was working well. And when I was on it, when I first got on it, I was like, wow, like this is working. I was staying late after work after a whole day on Zoom and doing the writing that I've been trying to just do for the whole time for that I was in LA, just trying to sit down and do something. And I was able to, because I have drive, I believe, without my ADHD, and just having the medication to help me sit down and do it was life changing.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what was the treatment center? Because I feel like that's huge. Like just
Yeah.
to be able to say, I've that's another thing I've talked about with guests, which is like how isolating and confusing and arduous the whole diagnosis journey can be, right? And how wonderful it is when you find these treatment centers that kind of hold you through the process of the diagnosis, but then also the treatment plan, and where you feel like people are actually looking out for you and looking after you,
Hmm.
which is so important in this
Hmm.
journey. So that's amazing that you found that place. What is it? So I'm like, so we can recommend it
Yeah.
to people.
Yeah. It's called Millennial ADHD, located in California. I think they take people all over. I'm not sure, but people can look into it. And they have a great team there that, helped me out. And they always check in and say, "Hey, you're due for a refill. Do you need more?" And, and they just hold your hand and always available to speak if you have questions or concerns or anything. And they just hold your hand through. It's something I hadn't had the first time around. So um, I definitely recommend finding a place like that or going there or, getting that help.
Hmm. Awesome. Um, Now, I'm curious. You talked about some of the issues in high school. Is there anything, one through this lens of an ADHD diagnosis? Was there anything that you looked back at on your childhood where you're like, oh, the signs were there all along? And then also, how did your family react to this diagnosis? Have you talked about it with them?
Yes. And yes, I have spoken to them about it with them. So in high school, I have a story about that too. But in high school, yeah, and this is something I still do sometimes, well, a lot, is on tests, I would read a sentence over and over and over again because it was not processing in my brain. I would just, I don't know why, I would like, I would think, how many times do I have to read this? I read it 5 times. Why don't I understand? I know I'm smart. I know what this says. I just can't process it. And that would be frustrating. And I just didn't think anything of it because I would always just read it a 20th time maybe and just be like, okay, I got it. Uh, and I just had to work a little harder. Uh, other other things that I did was, so I had the extra time on my test. That was something. Uh, let's see. There
Was
are
that a
plenty of things.
504 or was that just something that your teachers would give you?
That was just a regular
Oh, an
exam.
IEP? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, those
Oh, okay.
like just like multiple choice, like in history class, just any exams. Reading comprehension was hard for me. Like I was an excellent reader, but I couldn't, you know, process it out loud, just in my head. And so another thing that I noticed is it was very hard for me for summer reading. Summer reading lists, oh, I hated them. And, books are great. I enjoyed stories. I love the series Unfortunate Events. I think that book was okay because it really just, the way it talked to its readers, it just gave me like, oh, by the way, this word means this. It was just like a different type of, the way it was worded, I think helped with me being able to read those books. But it was always hard to complete my summer reading list. And I remember I had to read A Tree Grows in Brooklyn in English class, which is a great book. And I was so just nervous that I was not going to finish it by the time we got back to school. And so I had to go to the library, rent an audio book on those CDs, got my Walkman, popped them in, and I would listen to it and read along. I had to read along because my brain wouldn't just process it listening because my mind would wander. And the voice had to be interesting. It had to be like, and then this happened, like not just a robot, because then I don't think that would have worked. But fortunately, the woman reading the audiobook was interesting, and I read along, and it was processing, and I remembered it, and it was great because I finished it at the speed of the discs. I had a way to follow along and had a plan to finish the book. So I just, after one disc was done, I had the next disc and the next disc. And I think people with ADHD, or at least me, find it helpful when you break things into smaller pieces. It's less overwhelming. And that might be for most
Oh
people
yeah.
too, but
Oh yeah.
it's very helpful.
I know. I definitely have that with TV shows versus movies. If it's like, if it's like 7 o'clock and my husband will say, "Do you want to watch a movie?" I'm like, "God, no, I don't want to sit for a movie for 2 hours." But we'll
Yeah.
easily watch, 5 TV shows for half an hour.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
um,
100%.
it's funny when you talked about I know, right? Yeah, this is going to date me, but I really hated reading when I was a kid. I was not an avid reader until I discovered VC Andrews, which this is definitely dating me. But VC, I grew up in a very Christian household, very religious household. VC Andrews is not. And so I remember my mother being so excited that I was reading anything. She had no idea what VC Andrews was. I would like be in my room reading those books like for hours. It was like the first books I ever that actually captured my attention. And it's like you said, there was like something about it. I don't know if it was really just the subject, the horrific subject matter, or I see that with my kids too, where it's like they don't just like generally like reading, but when they get into a series where there's something about the writing or the topic or the subject matter or the wording or something to flow, they'll just inhale them, and that's really interesting. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, and going back to the math thing too, I also had a lot of struggles with like word problems in math, right? So it was like I was
Yeah.
fine with straight multiplication, division, all of that stuff, but whenever it was in
Yes.
paragraph form, I would have to reread it over and over and be like, "What are you asking me?"
Oh my gosh.
And when you said you couldn't, in a testing situation when you couldn't say it out loud, I was like, "Oh yeah, that's like even more frustrating when you can't." Well, like when you have to kind of do it all in your head as though the
Yeah.
saying it out loud auditory piece helps, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, I totally
Hmm.
related to that.
Yeah. And math, forget it.
Mhm.
I mean, algebra was great. I think I don't know if a lot of letters in there, but algebra, but those word problems, forget it. I would have to draw pictures to figure out the word problems on my paper. I'd be like, oh, this many balloons are here, and I need to, this many are. I had to draw it because my brain was not about to read each sentence and figure it out in my head with words.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I said this on other episodes where the only time I remember cheating in high school was in algebra because of I could never remember the formulas, and so I would write the formulas on the inside of my Texas Instruments calculator. And I'd write them in pencil in the plastic case so that like as soon as the test started, I would write them all on my test paper and then erase them so that I didn't get caught with my calculator. But I was like, I absolutely could not memorize those formulas. I don't know
Yeah,
like why it was ever expected of us to do that. It just felt
I don't know.
so unfair.
Yeah. I mean,
And
do
so I'm
people
like,
use
yes,
those
that is
today?
the one and only time I definitely cheated. No, I don't think they're required. Although my daughter's in high school now and there are some tests where she's required to like memorize formulas. Oh, I think it's like she has a physics test coming up, a final, and there's all these formulas she's really struggling with memorizing. And I'm like, why? Why on earth is that
Yeah.
required of kids? I don't know. It's really
I have
frustrating.
no idea.
Um, yeah. And then I also was reminded of Shakespeare. I could not read Shakespeare. I had to listen to
Oh,
Shakespeare like on records. That's also dating me. I
oh
would like
my
go to the
gosh.
library and find Shakespeare records and have to
Yeah.
listen to them at the same time. I still probably couldn't. I still probably couldn't just like sit down and read Shakespeare.
I mean, it
So
was,
I don't know if that's a neurodivergent thing or if that's a Shakespeare
yeah.
thing.
I mean, it's probably a little bit of both, but to go back to my English class in high school, um, there was one teacher that I had who didn't make us read. In one, I think it was my junior year, and she would always show us the movies instead of making us read. I think we would
Yeah.
read along in class, But she was like, "Oh, we're gonna watch the movie," and I was like, "I love her." I just because
I know, right?
yeah.
Yeah, so maybe that's just a Shakespeare thing. I don't know. I'm curious. I see what people respond to this conversation. Okay, so now I'm curious. How do you end up? How did you end up majoring in biology, and then how does a biology major end up being a writer in Hollywood?
Well, I am a writer's assistant, and my goal is to be a writer in Hollywood. And but I started out, I think, wanting to do uh, physical therapy when I was in college,
Okay.
going to college. I, put all my eggs in one basket and basically applied to like maybe two or three schools before I went to college. And the school that I really wanted to go to, I didn't get into. So I went to community college and I took all my prerequisites, there. And I didn't know what I wanted to major in. And you can major in an associate's degree, program. So I was looking down the list and I think I just, from high school, I had done like some editing for like some sports, from the sports teams in our high school. And I did some editing from the footage for for the local sports channel. And so I was like, oh, I think I'm interested in films. I love watching TV. I love movies. So I just randomly selected film editing. I was like, I'll do that. And then, I'm thinking as I'm going, I'm like, well, I mean, this is fun as a hobby, but I think I want to do physical therapy because I I didn't mention this, but I'm a black belt in Taekwondo. So I also grew up doing Taekwondo for most of
Awesome.
my, yeah, for a big portion of my life. So I was, always interested in like sporty things. And, I guess that has a lot to do with exerting energy and, you know, with my ADHD. But yeah, so I was doing that and see, look, here's my ADHD kicking in. Where was I? Where was I?
You're like, what was I talking about? I know, right?
Yeah, I
No, we were
mean,
talking
no,
about how
seriously.
you ended up being in from going from you wanted to major in biology because you wanted to be a physical therapist.
Yes, okay, there we go. And this happens often, by the way, with medication, unfortunately. So, yeah, so I said, oh, I want to do physical therapy. I like helping people. I love people. And then, I was in chemistry class in college and I was sitting in the lecture hall and oh my gosh, I looked at the board and I just saw lines, circles. They were speaking another language and I was like, I can't, I cannot. And so I got up and left and I changed my major because I said, why? I said, why am I doing this to myself? I'm a creative person. I was taking art classes in between these science classes. And like, I was always into art in high school. I was in the honor society, art honor society, and doing like actual art. But, creative wise, I was just like, this is not helping me exert any creativity. There's no way I can draw pictures for this. I mean, what am I going to draw? A flask? I mean, I can't. So I just, uh, got up and left and I met with the I was into TV and I had been doing some research and I didn't know screenwriting was a job until I did my research and looked at all the majors at my college. And so I went to them and told the professor, hey, I'm interested in majoring in screenwriting. And he was like, oh, you're gonna have to restart from the beginning. And I was like, oh. And he's like, but you can do cinema studies, which is like film history, and minor in screenwriting. So that's what I did. And there's a lot of watching movies and analyzing movies. And I think for me that was like something that just drew me in. Like that was good for me. Writing essays on films and stuff. That was for some reason that was I was able to do that. So yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, I think, through, I think of all the ways that we kind of look back at who we are and why we did things through this lens of ADHD, and you're like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. Um, yeah, now, so when it comes to your work right now in the television industry, do you feel like your ADHD is helping you? Like, is there anything about it that you sort of feel like is, you know, driving you?
Yes, I do. So I think one of the things that one of the things that is helping me is me being able to multitask. Um, because my brain, having ADHD, you're thinking about 10 different things at once. And so, like, I'm able to have my brain, like, go in different directions, like a team. Okay, split up and then go do things. And I'm able to do that and think about multiple things at once. And my job as a writer's assistant requires you to focus because I'm taking notes in the writer's room when all these writers are talking, and I have to be able to focus. And that's also why I got back on medication, because I was like, oh no, this is not going to work. I need to have a system because, when I'm talking to someone one on one, I will just space out. And so I can't do that here because they're leaning on me to have their conversation recorded. So I need to get myself together. So you know, um, with, I think being able to have my brain split up has actually kind of helped along with my medication to be able to take notes because so many people are talking. And now I'm finding myself like being able to hear what one person is saying, and then the other part of my brain's like, okay, the next person's talking, and I'm still, so like my brain's working to be able to take all these different notes from all these different voices. So I feel like somehow, if that makes sense, that's how it's helping me in my job right now.
It almost sounds like you're kind of a video game.
I know it does.
The way it's like all these moving parts and pieces, and you're just sort of like directing them all in your head.
Yeah.
That reminds me, you had said you had a funny family story about your ADHD diagnosis. I want to go back
Yeah.
to.
Okay, so my mom is a teacher. My dad's a pastor, and he was an assistant teacher, teacher's assistant. And uh, so my mom has been a teacher for years, and she's seen kids with ADHD, and mostly the kids that she's seen are the ones that get up and get out of their seat and keep talking and are just disrupt the class. And so I wasn't like that. So I think that's probably why she didn't think anything of it. And also, I just spoke to my mom recently, and she believes that she also probably has ADHD because I told her a bunch of, different things that I identified, like reading text over and over and different things. And she said, yeah, she has that too. And my mom is in her 60s, so she's like, yeah, I probably have it. And I said, you probably do. And she's coped with it too. And so I feel like because I didn't show any signs like of the of like I didn't look like the typical ADHD kid, like how she's seen it in her classroom, she probably didn't think that I had it, even when I was running in circles around the house as a kid, and she just let me until I got tired. And she just thought, hey, she's athletic because in school she's doing great. She's just an athletic kid. That's what she thought. She's like, so, and and I don't blame anybody because I just coped with it on my own, thinking it was normal because my mom thought it was normal too. She just because she coped with hers growing up, and I was getting good grades, so as long as that was working and I wasn't complaining, I think uh, that happened. But that's the funny story is I used to run in circles around the house, and I don't understand how nobody said she's got ADHD. I mean,
Right? Yeah.
yeah,
Well, yeah, it just goes to show how much we've learned about it and how, the signs were there, but we didn't know what to look for back then. And yeah, and so I think that's what I'm going through with both my kids right now, which is like they don't have a lot of the stereotypical signs of ADHD. So their teachers think that they're wonderful and well behaved and doing well and everything's fine. And yet I'm talking to all of these adults who are like, that was me, and now I have all this anxiety and perfectionism and
Oh yeah.
and and I'm like, okay, so how, right? So I'm like, what do we need to recognize in these kids if they're not running around in circles? Like, how do we help them as children so that they don't end up becoming these balls of anxiety and as adults, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes, like, I don't honestly know, right? Like, I feel like a diagnosis will help. And when I look into like executive function coaching, like the fact that that even exists, I think is really helpful with ADHD or not. I think it's such an important, these are such important life skills to be teaching kids, like how to write emails and how to, fold, clean their rooms or come up with schedules and all that stuff. Like you were saying, when you go to college and you're just like, oh my God, there aren't people looking out for me. There's not people making sure I wake up. The teachers don't make sure I'm doing my homework. Like you're just kind of pushed out of the nest.
You're on your own.
And, yeah, right. So I'm like, where are the ways in which we need to help these kids, any of them, so that they don't end up feeling like, I'm just managing on my own and I'm coping with it on my own. And then you get to adulthood and you're like, am I coping? I don't know. Was I ever coping? I don't feel like I'm coping. Yeah.
And,
go ahead.
Sorry. So, my dad, he's a pastor and he's been a pastor for over 40 years. And so I would always be in church and, now, I mean, I can go back and see, because this still happens where, I'm trying to listen to a sermon and I just thought I should be listening to this because it's important. It's part of my faith, and I can't listen and I can't. So for even church is hard for me still to listen and just listen to someone talk. It's just hard. And, so that was also a struggle. And I look back now, my dad's like, so what did you like about the sermon? And I'm like, and he doesn't know this, but one time he asked me that and I hung up the phone and pretended that I lost connection because I didn't know what I was like, you're doing great.
True confession time. No, but that's what's I think so interesting about the concept of masking, right? That's a great example. Sitting in church, having to sort of sit still, stare straight ahead and listen to a sermon. I mean, I did that growing up. And now that you mention it, my father always took notes. And when he was listening to sermons, I don't think he ever looked back at them, but I think it really helped him be a more active listener, to take notes. And then also I think it kept him from falling asleep. So, but the expectations to just stare straight ahead and listen, when you have ADHD, that's the worst way to listen. You can't be an active listener and stare straight ahead. So it's like, that's really such an important part of masking, which is like, if I look like I'm listening, then I'm not listening. If I look like I'm doing a million other things while you're talking, then I am like really interested and I'm really paying attention. If I'm also writing or also doodling or drawing, or fidgeting or all the other things that help you